This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand, and it is World War III again. It's all happening. Donald Trump is trying to stop Israel and Iran from destroying each other. Iran is trying to blow Israel off the face of the planet. Israel kind of got in first and half blew Iran off the face of the planet. Meanwhile, Russia and Ukraine are still fighting it out. China is rising as a global superpower and just licking its lips thinking, maybe we invade Taiwan. We don't even know if we've got a deal with the US over AUKUS. We don't even know if we've got the US as our main strategic ally anymore, although the UK and Keir Starmer somehow do. All this and more coming right up. But of course, all news is local. And the real story is that Albo missed out on his meeting with Donald Trump. He flew all the way to Canada to the G7 meeting for a meeting with Donald Trump. And then the night before it's meant to happen, old Trumpy, old orange guy bad, China, backs out, disappears, says, actually, you know what? I am going to go and deal with this World War III thing in the Middle East. So a lot of people are trying to punish Albo for that. The poor guy's suffered enough, frankly, as if it's his fault. Do you think is Albo saying, hey, guys, would you mind just escalating the war a bit so that Trump can pull out of his meeting with me? Like, how are people blaming Albo for this? I just don't understand. It's obviously just a bit of bad luck. The fact that he had secured the meeting is a win, very strong. The fact that Australia is not even a member of the G7, but is still going there and getting an audience with the US president, well, nearly getting an audience with the US president. Australia actually went as a guest of Canada, because, of course, we all know that Canada is just Australia with snow. And Albo crossed literally about as far as you can pretty much go across the planet, and ended up there and ended up just going there to the other side of the world for pretty much just no reason whatsoever. You know who is in the G7? Canada. So why are they in it and we're not? And also Italy. What's Italy doing? I mean, love the joint. Big fan of the Roman Empire. But let's face it, it's not what it was, So I think the fact that Albo got there, got the meeting in the first place is a win, even if it was Clayton's meeting that actually never took place. We're going to be speaking later on to an expert about what all this means, incidentally, and whether or not we truly are on the brink of World War III. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, Donald Trump drops everything. He'd been told before he was even going to the G7, what are you doing going to the G7 when there's this potential World War III thing happening with Iran, maybe not on the verge of developing nuclear weapons. Maybe it already has them. Probably not. But, do you really want to find that out when they launch it? And Donald Trump said, no, I'm still going to the G7. Then, of course, being Donald Trump, he gets to the G7 and he goes, actually, you know what? Yeah, I better go and do this thing. And someone said, oh, Donald, you're going to get a ceasefire? He goes, oh, no, I'm going to get much more than a ceasefire. Much more than a ceasefire. I'm going to stop the whole thing. I'm going to make Iran surrender. Now, I'm not convinced that Iran is going to agree to a peace that is negotiated by a country that it literally calls Satan and whose citizens begin public meetings by chanting, death to America. I'm not sure they're then going to turn around and say, okay, you know what? You decide. Yeah, we'll do whatever you say, Satan. I think it'd be a bit more like Jesus in the desert where they'd say, get behind me, Satan. Don't want to know what happens after that. So they're still going hard at each other. Israel needs the US to give it or use some of its big bunker-busting bombs. So the US has got these missiles that can smash deep into the ground, deep underground, where the Iranians have their uranium or their potential nuclear missiles, their nuclear programs, their little underground labs. It's all very James Bond. That is why Israel wants to bring the US into the war, or at least get a hold of the missiles. Presumably, the missiles are subject to some pretty heavy intellectual property copyright. So the Americans would probably have to be the ones that actually use those missiles. And that would mean America actually firing on Iran. What happens then? Well, possibly nothing. Possibly that's all she wrote, because nobody likes Iran. Iran sucks, or rather the Iranian regime sucks. So Iran used to be in an alliance with Syria and Russia. Now, don't know if you guys have been following the news much recently, but Syria ain't no more. The Assad regime has fallen. Syria's been overtaken by all these rebels. And it's fair to say that its alliance with Iran is no longer a going concern. Should we say it's yet to be finalised? It's still got Russia. But again, not sure if you've been following the news recently, but Russia's kind of got a bit on its plate. It's kind of got another war that it's embroiled in, and it's not doing as well as it would like. And it certainly doesn't have too many spare soldiers or spare equipment to be handballing Iran's way. And of course, that would bring it into conflict with the US, which it probably doesn't want. But what about all the other Gulf states, all the other Arab states? Surely they wouldn't want America wading in again and getting embroiled in another war like they did in Iraq or Afghanistan. Well, see, they don't like Iran either. Nobody likes Iran. You know who else doesn't like Iran? See, Iran is Shiite Muslim, and the rest of the Gulf states are Sunni Muslim. And, you know, they could get pretty tetchy about that. That's kind of when people start to die, get beheaded, you know, burned alive, you know, stoned to death, you know, mass public hangings, that sort of stuff. That's what, you know, their theological arguments can quickly take a turn for the worse. So they don't like Iran either. And the other group of people who don't like Iran is Iranians. The Iranians hate the regime. That's why they had a revolution there during the Arab Spring in 2009. And of course, it was only the incredibly brutal repression of those people who protested that eventually forced them into submission, forced a lot of them to flee the country. I actually know someone who fled Iran after the 2009 attempted revolution, if you want. And now that Israel has basically wiped out almost all of Iran's military leadership, maybe another revolution's on the cards. So no one is there for Iran. Russia is its only ally. Russia's busy invading Ukraine. The Gulf states around it all hate it because it's the wrong religion, and they're not just the wrong religion, but they are the most active, repressive proselytizers and enforcers of the wrong religion. The Iranians' own people, there's no support for the regime among the common people in Iran. They've risen up before. Maybe they will again. And Israel, which is that little country that keeps bombing the bejesus out of Iran, it don't like it much either. So I actually reckon that this little World War III could be over quite quickly with Iran basically running away with its tail between its legs. This could actually be, you know, a fairly, if America gets involved especially, it could be a fairly kind of, all over Red Rover type of affair. But that's the good news. The bad news is that World War III is still coming, possibly via China, possibly via Russia. And how do I know this? Well, because we are now coming to what seems to be the end of what is probably the longest stretch of global peacetime in all of human history. They call the period since World War II the Long Peace. And that's because World War II was so utterly horrific. The worst conflict, the worst slaughter, the worst genocide the world has ever seen, that we put up all these organisations to stop it from happening again. We established the United Nations, we established NATO, we established all these rules, all these blocks, all these treaties in order to stop a massive global conflict from ever happening again. Yes, there have been little flare-ups. There was Vietnam, there was a couple of Gulf Wars, a bit of Somalia, bit of Eastern Europe, but by and large, there has not been a major war since then, especially not involving superpowers fighting each other. And that is the exception. That is this exception that proves the rule. So all these people, generations of people, We had a generation of people who said, actually, no, I'm not going to go and fight in Vietnam. That would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. So all these people like me, who have lived never having known war, never having to had to worry about war, this just reminds us that war is actually the norm for humankind. And that is the terrifying thing about us. That war, not peace, is the default position of people, of the human race. And that is what we are seeing right now. And that is why we always have to be ultra careful to try and nip it in the bud. As I mentioned earlier in the show, we are on the brink of World War III. So what does this mean for the average Australian? Well, we're going to find out what Australia thinks of this whole new foreign policy global landscape that we've found ourselves in, from the wildness and the unpredictability of Donald Trump. Is the AUKUS agreement, our security pact with the United States and the United Kingdom, in peril? What's going to happen with Iran and Israel? Donald Trump has just had to pull out of the G7 to go and fix that mess, or is he going to just make a new one? Well, to answer all these questions and more, I'm joined by a very eminent guest. His name is Ryan Neelam. He is the director of the Public Opinion and Foreign Policy Program at the Lowy Institute, which is the premier international relations think tank in Australia. He's a former diplomat himself of 14 years' experience. He just came back as Deputy Consul General of Hong Kong. And he joins me right here. Ryan, welcome to The Real Story. How are you?
So good to be with you, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
It's so good to have you. Ryan also set up my sister with her husband. So I feel like he's a man of impeccable taste, impeccable judgment. But look, thanks so much. You are the author of the annual Lowy poll, or the guy pulling it all together. And this is this huge deep dive into what Australia thinks about kind of everything, but especially what's happening in the world around us, what is going on, should we be in fear of our lives and diving into the backyard bunker? The thing that really stood out to me is that the faith in America and faith in the US under Donald Trump doing the right thing globally has completely collapsed, hasn't it?
That's right. It's one of the more significant changes we've seen. We've been doing this poll for 21 years now, Joe.
Yep.
And over that time, we've seen a few big shifts. One of them is attitudes towards China, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. But this year, trust in the United States to do the right thing in the world has dropped by 20 points since last year.
Wow.
Obviously, the change with Donald Trump in the White House has had a big effect on how Australians view their key security ally. And when we ask about the specific policies that Donald Trump has brought in his first 100 days in office, this poll was taken in March, just for context, we've seen high levels of disapproval across the board, from his use of tariffs, his wish to acquire Greenland, his
I almost forgot about that. Like, he's done so much crazy stuff since then that you forget that.
Well, he hasn't given that up either, and also, I mean, his attempts to negotiate with Vladimir Putin on the future of Ukraine, his cuts to US aid. Australians across the board have rejected these policies, and I think it speaks to the instincts of Australians that we've seen over 21 years in this poll, where we're internationalist, we want to see a rules-based system constraining great powers and allowing for open trade, and we by and large want an ally that is present in the region and looking out for the stability of the region.
And this is the other interesting thing about it, because it's not that Australians are turning away from America and saying, all right, well, we've got to, look to China now to protect us, or some other big regional power. Australians overwhelmingly want America to be our number one ally. Like something like 80%.
That's right.
4 out of 5 Australians consistently say America should be our best friend. And yet, I think the figure was something like 27, only 27% of people actually think that America will do the right thing in the world.
Yeah, 36% of Australians say they trust the US to do the right thing in the world.
Right,
but you're right, 80% continue to see the alliance as important to our security. So this is one of the fascinating things, that the fact that trust has really fallen off a cliff, but the sense that the alliance is important to our security has not really changed substantially since last year. So, I think it actually speaks to something that people don't often give Australians credit for, is that people can hold two things in their minds at the same time. They can dislike the direction that Donald Trump is taking our major security partner, but they can also be pragmatic and think that, well, we need the US in certain respects as well. And one of those reasons, I think, is you see continued distrust of our major trading partner, China, especially after the last few years where we've had serious diplomatic rupture with China, that things are on a more even keel now, not necessarily stable, but stabilising, as the government says. But I think that's one of the contributing factors why people still have this sense that, of insecurity, and that we actually need an ally like the United States.
And it's such a shame, isn't it? Because there was this almost an assumption, you could talk about, Francis Fukuyama and the end of history or whatever, but there was an assumption that China would inevitably open up, it would liberalise economically, and then it would inevitably liberalise politically and just gradually open up. And the former kind of happened, but then Xi Jinping comes to power and suddenly it's going in the other direction. It's becoming more nationalist, more aggressive, and you're seeing that the number of Australians who have that positive view of China come down as a result, obviously.
Absolutely. How
worried are you, as someone who has been on the front line in that region? As I said, you were a senior diplomat in Hong Kong until recently. How do you see that playing out? Because I think, and again, I don't want to get too sort of highbrow or esoteric, but there's, a lot of people have likened the geopolitical kind of chessboard, if you like, to being quite similar before the outbreak of World War I, where you've got, an end of sort of bipolarity. You've got a great power seemingly on the decline in the form of the US or, the UK in 2014. And then you've got, an emerging power that thinks, hang on a minute, I haven't got my fair share. So China is a bit like Germany saying, hang on, you guys have been taking all the goodies. It's time for us to stake our sort of claim on the globe. Is that too alarmist? Are you more?
Look,
how would you?
I think, like with the US, we also need to be able to hold a few things in our minds at the same time when it comes with China. One of those is that there are good reasons to be concerned about the way China's building up its military. It hasn't really given clarity to other countries in the region about what its intentions are. It's expressed clear designs to retake Taiwan if forced by necessary. It hasn't ruled out the use of force. It hasn't said that it will do that either. We should be clear on that. And there are well documented human rights concerns in China. They've wielded their economic might as well against Australia. We've seen that very clearly in the past few years. So all of those are good reasons for concern and to be wary of China, which I think shows very clearly in our polling figures here. We see only 20% of Australians trust China to act responsibly compared to 36% of the US. Neither are good figures, but less trust China.
Just quickly, the figure you mentioned, the US, I mean, more Australians think that Indonesia will behave more responsibly on the world stage than the US will.
Yes.
Which, when you consider the recent history of that country and the fact that you've got a former military hard man now as the president who with a questionable track record, that speaks volumes about how worried people are about the US and how low it's fallen in people's confidence.
Yeah, look, I mean, I have a sort of different perspective on Indonesia. I think, if anything, it's surprising that we haven't been able to grow closer to Indonesia, given its importance, its weight, that it's a country of I think it's 250 million people in our region. It's going to be one of the major economies, and we actually haven't managed over decades of foreign policy to become a closer partner with Indonesia. And part of that, I think, speaks to a difference in perceived values and a whole range of issues that have come up over the course of our relationship history. But look, I mean, just returning to China, I think the other realities that we need to bear in mind, alongside the fact that it is building up its military, that it is, saying that it wants to retake Taiwan eventually, it remains our largest trading partner. And that's a fact that we've tried to change, we've tried to diversify, and we haven't been able to do that just because of the weight of China's economy, and what we sell to the world goes predominantly to China. The other aspect is there is not a global issue that you can solve without China. So whether it's climate change, preventing the next pandemic,
Preventing World War III.
preventing World War III. That's definitely, they're right in the centre of that.
Please don't. Please just don't. Thank you.
So I think, we need to be able to balance all of these things. And I think that's what the government is trying to do. I mean, people will have different perspectives on how effective they are at that. But we need to recognise that China is important. It behaves in a way that concerns us in many respects, but that we need to have a relationship with China in order to manage all of those interests.
Yeah, that's right. And again, as a very boring sort of pragmatist, I am one of those people who says we need to keep a lot of balls in the air. At the same time, we need to walk and chew gum. There's all the people that say, well, just yell at China more, yell at China and tell them we hate them. It's like,
yeah. I mean, the other thing
yell at Donald Trump, tell him he's an idiot. It's like, I'm not sure that's going to work.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that perhaps might be a bit overblown from time to time is the perception that China is out to get us. We did see China circumnavigate Australia before the last election. That's clearly a sign that they are now a power that can go wherever they like in the world, that they have the ability to project force outside of their region. They're trying to prove that, but that does not mean that China would find it desirable or even practicable to invade Australia or take over Australia, right? I mean, I think that sometimes gets far overblown in how we look at China. What China is ultimately trying to do is prove that it is the dominant power in the region. It wants to push the US as far out of its doorstep as it can, and it wants countries like Australia to essentially play vassal states to its interests. It doesn't want to be opposed on what it sees as its core interests, including Taiwan. So those are the sort of, I think, nuances that are important to grasp with China's position.
And so where do you see this? And I guess we'll get into AUKUS and other stuff very shortly. But where do you see it sort of ending? Is China's rise inevitable, or is China possibly going to collapse under the weight of its own kind of demographics? It's going to have an aging population, which we're all sort of struggling to come to terms with. It's going to have to pay for. What happens when Xi Jinping, he's got dictator for life, obviously, but what happens when he dies? Is the next guy inevitably going to be another kind of party hard man in that mold, or could he be a liberalizer? Could she be a liberalizer? Maybe they'll the next Susan Ley of China. Could
she be the liberal? I think that boat has sailed.
Yeah. But,
no, I mean, look, on China's rise, let's bring it back to the sort of what we found in the poll, what Australians think about China's rise, which is really interesting. 56% of Australians think that China will be the most powerful country in the world in 10 years' time. That's more than double the figure that think the US will remain the most powerful country in the world. So in the minds of over half of the population, that is essentially already what they're expecting, that China will be the dominant country in the world. There's been a lot of skepticism or commentary about China's demographic trends, its domestic challenges, its property market, its economic slowdown, that it hasn't been able to maintain as high growth rates as in the past. But I think there's still a lot of staying power when it comes to China and its huge population, its resolve to grow its power and its economy. I mean, it can do things because it's an autocratic state. It can simply make things happen in a way that democracies like Australia and the United States can't.
Or India as well. If you look at India, India is a much more complicated country because it is democratic, and because you can't just sort of, flood a village of 200,000 people to build a new dam if you want to or whatever. So, I mean, one thing that's interesting is that this poll shows it, and it shows it every year, and I'm always impressed, but it shows that Australians are pretty switched on. I think so. I think a lot of people would think Australians are all just sort of, kicking
detached
back.
from the world.
Detached from the world, oversexed, overpaid and over here, or, we grew here, you flew here, go back to where you came from. In fact, it shows Australians are obviously really thinking about this stuff. And it seems to be getting it right. Like, they seem to be, like, what Australians think seems to be what I think, what you presumably
for the most part, I think,
get it pretty spot on.
Yeah.
So this brings us to AUKUS, which obviously everyone has been trying to take a crap on from great height. But I'm a supporter of AUKUS. What do the average Australians think of AUKUS? What are they?
Well, it's a pretty positive, and actually I find this interesting in that it's remained positive since the deal was announced 4 years ago. This is the deal.
They didn't watch that Four Corners episode, obviously.
I mean, that was that had some pretty serious concerns raised about AUKUS. But I mean, this is the deal we're talking about. Just to be clear, what the question we ask is do you favour or not the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines? We didn't ask about AUKUS per se, just that what's at the core of that deal is that the US is going to help us get nuclear-powered submarines in the future. And
several decades' time, maybe.
It's a long timeline and a large cost. 2/3 of the public, just on that central question, say yes, they favour it. And that hasn't really moved in a substantial way since 4 years ago. And that's despite the fact that you've had former prime ministers, Paul Keating, Malcolm Turnbull, come out very strongly against AUKUS. You've had concerns about what does having these submarines mean for our ability to say no to the United States, and what does it mean for the cost? Because it's 360 billion is the estimate over 30 years. What does that mean for the trade-offs on other priorities, health and education, for instance? So these are the questions that we're grappling with. I think there's a lot more debate to be run on AUKUS. People haven't really had to contend with those trade-offs particularly, and I think that's where we might start to see the rub come for AUKUS. But when you ask people about the capability, I think there's an instinctive, well, sure. I mean, I think it's better to have a more formidable defence deterrent, but then how it's actually going to play out, how we're going to make it happen, are the questions that are yet unanswered.
That's right. Or whether the US, because there's a clause that the US only gives us the submarines if it has enough that are surplus to its own requirements.
That's right. And there's serious concerns about its ability to sustain its own defence.
And my feeling is, and again, tell me if I'm wrong, but my feeling is, in fact, the submarines are just a kind of incredibly expensive MacGuffin. The point of AUKUS isn't necessarily getting the nuclear submarines and having that capability, although that would also obviously be welcome, but the fact that it binds the US's strategic interests and Australia's strategic interests inextricably together. So, we've already got ANZUS, obviously, our oldest treaty, but this basically means we are essentially one and the same.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty sharp observation, Joe. I mean, there are people on both sides who advocate for AUKUS because of that. There are, I think it was Kurt Campbell in the Biden administration, a very senior official who actually made comments to that effect when he was asked about AUKUS. He said that it is essentially about binding Australia into US strategy in the region. And there are many people that see AUKUS as a vehicle to bind the US to the region in a way that is not certain under Donald Trump, mind you. I think that's one reason that some people advocate for AUKUS. But the other thing that's happening now is there's this review that the Pentagon is doing into AUKUS. And so, I mean, in the one sense, you've got some people or some leaders trying to maintain this common message of deterrence. The US and Australia and UK are in it together against Chinese aggression. The other aspect of it is you've got mixed signals coming out of the White House now, and we don't know where it's going to land. And
obviously, unfortunately, the President, Donald Trump, had to leave G7 before his scheduled meeting with Anthony Albanese. But he did have time to have a meeting with Keir Starmer, because, of course, there is another partner in AUKUS, and that's the UK. And Starmer said, the deal is still on. We are still proceeding. Does that mean, presumably, there can be no UKUS? So if the US is proceeding with, and I think Donald Trump just sort of nodded along. He didn't, and presumably Trump's the sort of person who would not allow someone to say something they didn't like.
No,
but presumably, if the UK is saying AUKUS is still on, then if it's still on for them, then surely it's still on for us. And maybe this review is just a bit of a bargaining chip that Donald Trump will use to try to get us to ratchet up our defence spending. Is there
potentially? I mean, there's a number of ways this could go. I mean, I wouldn't say that is definitive. Donald Trump sort of nodding along, or the UK saying something, but Trump not actually saying something. I mean, I think the first time Trump was asked about AUKUS this term, he said, "What?" I'm sorry, what's that?
He said, "Oh, yeah, I've heard of it."
I don't know if you heard of it.
That's right, maybe, yeah. Well, I think if you have to say that you've heard of something, chances are you probably haven't heard of something.
That's right. But I think there's a number of ways this could play out, and one of them is that Trump turns around and says, "Look, my predecessor Joe Biden made this terrible deal, and I'm going to make it better by asking the Aussies to pay more." Or
I'm Donald Trump. I'm the greatest. I've got a better
exactly, and then just rebrand it and ask for a bit more money, or it could go a number of ways, or they could actually find that, and this is the more optimistic, hopeful path for us, is that we succeed in convincing the US of the benefits of AUKUS to the US. I mean, we're paying into their industrial base so they can make more submarines.
Like $800 million, haven't we?
Yeah, that's right. And part of the rationale for this, presumably, is that we share that deterrence project of deterring Chinese
they
use
get to
of
have all
force.
their Marines in Darwin.
They can.
It's in
burden
Pine Gap and
it's burden sharing. So that's the idea. So I mean, the idea that this is just that we're just a kind of freeloaders on the US. I think AUKUS is a strong counterpoint to that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as I'm fond of saying, or as I do say, Australia is the only ally that has been with the US in every single of its foreign expeditions, however questionable. The French didn't go with them to Iraq. The British didn't go with them to Vietnam. We did. In both cases, we paid for our loyalty. We showed our loyalty with blood. So that's surely got to be, I think we've proved ourselves that we're not just riding on the coattails of...
I agree with you, but I don't think that counts for much with Trump. He's pretty values-free, and I don't think arguments of loyalty and history count for much. It's more, what are you going to deliver for him in that time, and how are you going to make him look good?
So just so we don't end on a note where everyone's jumping out the window.
Sure.
And I completely agree with you, and even if I didn't, it'd be irrelevant because you're much more expert on these matters than I am. But can the scaffolding around Donald Trump, can the sort of institutional, congressional support for Australia in the US, surely that will sort of outlast him and ameliorate some of his worst impulses? I know that Donald Trump is draining the swamp and he's not listening to anyone who isn't fully MAGA or whatever, but he can only be there for another 3.5 years, assuming the conspiracy theorists are wrong and he doesn't appoint himself Xi Jinping. Surely things sort of return to normal, and AUKUS being such a long-term agreement will sort of outlast Donald Trump. Or could he just tear it all up? What's the potential for his... what's the most amount of damage he could do?
Well, the most amount of damage is he could tear it all up, and he could walk away from alliances in the Indo-Pacific. We've seen him essentially turn his back on the NATO alliance with Europe. He's said in as many words as, if NATO allies don't, we're not going to come to rescue unless you pay your way. So that's the caveat, and actually they're making steps to do that. But he's clearly not he's not starry-eyed, or doesn't have a sense that alliances are important for the US unless they deliver for it in a very clear way. And I think the worst case scenario is that he actually starts to say, well, look, I mean, Asia's pretty far away, and China is a strong power. He's got a certain admiration for strong men, and there are spheres of influence here, and why do we need to spend all this US treasure and blood on maintaining a presence in Asia and balancing China? Why don't we kind of pull back closer to home? Now, I should say none of the indications from the Trump administration so far show that it's going to do that. His defense secretary was actually pretty clear that the administration sees this region as a priority. Yet we are seeing Trump then kind of look to Iran. He's looking to Gaza. He's got all these other things happening, and we've seen it before. Trump sort of looks at the next thing, or something comes up.
Reality catches up with him, doesn't it? Either it proves his miracle cure doesn't work, or he gets sort of brought back to some kind of bandwidth of normality, maybe on the very fringes of normality, but something that isn't quite catastrophic.
Yeah, I think there's good reasons to be sort of sober about what there are very bad scenarios that could play out, but the likelihood of those happening is not necessarily high. But we have to be vigilant, especially when it comes to what Trump is doing on global institutions. So when we talk about trade, world trade, he's taking a sledgehammer to the system that has made Australia rich, essentially. The idea that you have open, rules-based trade where countries aren't putting tariffs on each other. He's actually basically completely changed that and upended that system in a matter of months. And we have to be worried about that. The other thing is we have to be worried about what he says about taking Greenland, annexing the Panama Canal,
Yep.
making Canada the 51st state. You might. It's kind of tempting to laugh it off, right?
No, that's right.
But this is the supposed leader of the free world.
Yeah.
Saying that threatening the use of force to take territory from other countries. We have not seen that since World War II. A major power like the United States saying that it would do that, and to treaty allies no less. So there are norms that are at stake that have actually held the world together and kept, large scale, to come back to your starting point, World War III from happening. And those right now are very much under assault from all sides.
There you go. So World War III is happening.
I'm not sure I helped you with the mission of stopping people from jumping out the window. I'm sorry.
That's all right. We'll just mean that they'll just have to tune in next week to find out whether we're all still here. Ryan, Neil, thank you so much for joining us on The Real Story.
Great to chat.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much, Joe. Cheers.
Well, on that cheery note, that's all we have time for this week. And if there is still a world left in which we are all alive, we will see you next week. In the meantime, you can flick us an email at therealstory@novapodcasts.com.au. You can hit me up on Insta, Joe_Hildebrand. Slide into my DMs. We can have a little chat. Or you can just like everything I post, which is not very much. But it's quality, not quantity. Not what you got. Anyway, you can also catch my columns every Monday and Saturday in the various News Corp mastheads around the country. And of course, you can leave us a review or you can leave us a 5-star rating on the podcast provider of your choice. Till then, see you next week.